Okay, so an issue that's been getting quite a bit of attention during the last few years that involves questions related to entitlement and desert and fairness that we're exploring here involves professional athletics. Specifically, it involves pay differentials for athletes in men's professional sports versus women athletes in women's professional sports. And people will point to, the NBA, men's basketball, and they'll look at the salaries of those players and be like, oh my word, look at what those salaries are compared to the salaries paid to these female athletes in the WNBA. There is no comparison. You take somebody like LeBron James and from the NBA, and you compare his salary to a superstar in the WNBA like Caitlin Clark, and to say that he's making exponentially more than her is an understatement. I mean, there's just no comparison. And we'd see the same thing if we looked at men's professional soccer versus women's professional soccer. Again, there's this huge differential in pay, and that's caused a lot of people to say, well, that's not fair. It's not fair because whether you're playing in the NBA or the WNBA, whether you're playing on the men's soccer team or the women's soccer team, you're doing the same thing. You're either throwing that ball down the court and into the hoop, or you're kicking that ball down the field and into the net. Okay? Whether you're male or female, doesn't matter. You're essentially doing the same thing. And because you're doing the same thing, you have a moral claim to be paid equally. In fact, some have gone so far as to say, this is such a basic thing that it's not only that you have a moral claim to equal pay, you should have an entitlement to equal pay. And so there was legislation proposed that would have required that male and female athletes in their respective leagues in the same sport be paid the same. Okay, so there's been a claim here that this unfairness is not only not giving people what they deserve, it's not giving people what they should be entitled to get. And this makes a certain amount of intuitive sense, right? So you think about you at your job. Let's say that you're a server at a restaurant, and you have a colleague, and you and this colleague are equally effective, equally reliable servers at this restaurant. You're both equally good at your jobs, and you've been there the same amount of time. And then you come to find out that your colleague gets paid more than you. And when you inquire why, your boss tells you, well, it's because he or she is older than you. Well, you'd probably cry foul, because you'd be like, well, wait a minute. Just because I'm younger doesn't justify distributing the resources in the way that you are. We're doing the same job at the same degree of performance. I deserve to be paid what this other person is paid. We should be paid equally. And in fact, you might even go a step further than that and say, it's not just that I have a moral claim to equal pay. I'm entitled to equal pay because it's illegal to discriminate against people on the basis of age. And so we might make that a similar kind of line of argument here with regard to these professional athletes. On the other hand, somebody's going to come around from the other side and say, wait, hold on. Let's take a teleological approach to this, right? This Aristotelian telos. What is the purpose of the thing that we're deliberating about? In other words, here, what is the purpose of professional athletics? Is it just to kick the ball down the field or toss the ball down the court? Is that why we have professional athletics? And some folks are going to say, well, no, that's not the purpose of professional athletics. The purpose of professional athletics is to function as a business to generate revenue. That's the purpose of professional sports. People like to watch people kick that ball down the field or throw that ball through the hoop, and they like to watch people who are really good at it. And so the better they are at it, the more they like to watch them. And the more they like to watch them, the more they're going to pay to watch, and the more they're going to provide support for the businesses that provide these athletes the opportunities to perform the things that people like to watch. And so they might look at, for example, the World Cup for the Women's Soccer League in 2019. It got 1 billion viewers, and it generated $131 million in revenue, as opposed to the Men's World Cup in 2018 that got about 3.5 times more viewers, right? It's 3.6 billion viewers, but it generated $6 billion in revenue. Okay, and I don't know all the reasons for that. I think the advertising is probably more expensive for men's soccer than women's soccer, and there's probably a whole bunch of other variables here. It's a total guess. It's probably the case that it's more likely that both men and women would buy men's soccer paraphernalia than men and women buying female soccer paraphernalia. That's just a total stab in the dark. But at any rate, there's a difference in the amount of revenue that these two leagues generate. And so we could make the argument that even though this is an unequal distribution of the rewards, the revenue, it's justifiable. And it's justifiable because one league is generating more of the rewards to be distributed. We might also look at the working conditions of these two leagues. We might ask ourselves, or we might ask a question like, well, are the agreements between the leagues and the players the same in every way except for salary? And again, somebody might point to the contracts that the players in these two leagues collectively agreed to. In the Women's Soccer League, they opted for a very high base pay. In other words, here's your guaranteed income for being a player on a team. And so you get a high base pay and a lower performance-based pay. In other words, they opted to get a higher salary with smaller bonuses for making goals or kicking successful passes or blocks or whatever, as opposed to the athletes in the Men's Soccer League. They chose a very low base pay. Right? They took a gamble. They're like, hey, you don't have to pay me a lot in my salary, but I want some really expensive performance-based incentives here. Every time I kick a goal, I want to get paid a lot in compared to what those women in the female soccer league agreed to. And so we might say like, well, these are different pay structures that might account for the differences in salaries between these two leagues. So this isn't to justify the salary differentials. It's just to say that an inequality might not indicate an unfairness. And one way we can determine whether or not it does is to look at it from a teleological point of view. What is the purpose of this thing that we're considering?